Right, let's get going. So good evening, everyone. And look, thank you very much. Thank you to John for the introduction and to Lilia for helping. And thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with you tonight. As I said, my name's Gail Pollard. I am an epidemiologist. I work for the Metro South Public Health Unit, which is broadly speaking part of Queensland Health. And I should note that tonight I'm here speaking to you in a private capacity. I'm not representing Queensland Health in any way, and the views I present do not necessarily represent those of Queensland Health. That's just a disclaimer. John's covered my background in coral reef ecology and moving through stats into public health, and then COVID hit in 2020 and my life became very focused in on one disease. So I'm an epidemiologist, and before I start, I should clarify that epidemiology is the study of how diseases move through populations. And this was never brought into the public consciousness more than it was in 2020 over the past 3 years, while we've lived and continue to live with COVID. Now, I've just got to work out okay. So my talk tonight is in several parts, 4 parts. I'm going to start off with some background information and definitions. We're then going to walk through some pandemics of the past, then focus in on our current COVID pandemic, and then look at the question, are we prepared for the next one? Now, in speaking tonight about pandemics, the risks they pose and preparedness for them in the future, it's important that we start with some definitions of key terms so that we're all on the same page, so to speak, speaking the same language. So firstly, one of the things that can be confusing is the difference between a disease outbreak, let's move my glasses, an epidemic and a pandemic. So an outbreak occurs when there are unexpectedly high numbers of cases of a particular disease in a population or a community or a geographical area. It may stay in that one area or community, or it may extend more widely, and it can last days or much longer. In public health units like the one where I work, assisting and investigating outbreaks, assisting with the management of outbreaks and investigation into them is absolutely one of our key pieces of work, our bread and butter. Whether it be gastro in childcare centres, flu in aged care facilities, or food or waterborne diseases like salmonella or cryptosporidiosis linked to an event or a camp or a specific premises, something like that. So that's an outbreak. An epidemic occurs when an infectious disease spreads quickly to more people in a community or region than expected. So where's the line between an outbreak and an epidemic? It's not a firm line, it's fuzzy. But an epidemic usually affects a much larger area than an outbreak, and an epidemic can be, and in fact usually is, made up of a series of separate outbreaks. So then a pandemic is a disease outbreak that spreads across countries or continents. It affects more people and takes more lives than an epidemic. The World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a pandemic when it became clear that the illness was severe and that it was spreading very quickly over a very wide area. And like an epidemic, a pandemic includes many separate outbreaks usually. So again, the line between epidemic and pandemic is one of judgment, not one of firm definition. And finally, a disease is said to be endemic when it's present in the population at all times. So for example, rhinovirus that causes the common cold is endemic in our population. And COVID-19 may well be on the way to becoming endemic. Now, the severity of the severity of a pandemic can be defined by a combination of its morbidity, the amount of sickness it causes, and its mortality, or the number of deaths it causes. And this depends on a wide range of factors. The first is the pathogen, the bug involved. This might be a virus, as with COVID, a bacterium like cholera, or even a fungus or a multicellular parasite. Linked to this is the severity of the disease that the pathogen causes. Whether this is a new pathogen that we haven't met as a population before, and so we have no pre-existing immunity, or whether there's residual immunity in some people from past exposure to the same or related pathogens, or are some sectors of the population more vulnerable than others? Young people, the very old, pregnant women, young adults. Forgive me, I am working some notes tonight. So the other thing another issue that can factor into the severity of a pandemic is the mode of transmission. How is that pathogen transmitted from one person to the next? Viruses and bacteria are commonly spread person to person, but this can be achieved in a lot of different ways. There's direct contact, as in sexually transmitted infections or lots of flus and gastro. Contaminated surfaces, which is possible with COVID, which is why we were all madly cleaning everywhere. And it's very common with your gastro illnesses like norovirus, sweeps through childcare centres, through surfaces. And then there's respiratory droplets, so coughing and sneezing, as happens with the common cold or the flu. And then airborne particles. That's the most insidious and the hardest to combat. COVID, it turns out, becomes airborne. So this isn't droplets. It's not like little bits of spit and whatnot that go into the air, but actually the virus is so small that it becomes airborne. So the best example of that is measles. And the air in a room in which a person with measles has been, an infectious person with measles, the air in that room remains infectious for at least 20 minutes, potentially up to 2 hours after the infectious person has walked out, has left, because that measles virus is just circulating in the air and it takes time for it to actually drop down and come out of the air. And finally, there's the involvement of a vector or a middleman. For example, malaria can't spread from person to person directly. Its pathogen, Plasmodium falciparum, lives in a mosquito, and it only spreads to humans when the mosquito bites another person. So staying on severity, the next thing is how infectious is the pathogen? How many people can an infected person expect to pass that infection on to? To assess this, we use a measure called the reproduction number, or R0. It is a measure of the transmission potential of an infectious disease. So it's the average number of new cases that an infected person will generate over the course of their whole infectious period, if everyone in the population is susceptible and no control measures are in place. So no vaccination, no mask wearing, no nothing, just if that disease is introduced into a population, how many people are going to catch it from each person. So if an R0 is less than 1, then each case will on average infect less than 1 person, and the disease will reduce and possibly eventually die out in the population. Conversely, if it's greater than 1, the disease has the potential to spread and sustain itself in the population. Now, this graphic shows the estimated R0 values for a number of diseases. The first one there is Ebola, very nasty bug, but it's got a relatively, there's my cursor for those online, it has a relatively low reproduction number of 2. The original SARS-CoV, the original COVID virus, was somewhere between 2 and 3. We then had the Alpha variant, it was higher at 4 to 5. The Delta variant was higher again at 5 to 8, but measles beats them all. It sits somewhere between 12 and 18. So as control measures are put in place, tracking changes in that R0, or what it becomes is RE, estimated reproduction number, is an important way to gauge the effectiveness of the control measures that you've got in place. Things like vaccination, quarantine, isolation of cases, social distancing, mask wearing. And that's what epidemiologists like myself did and are continuing to do through the COVID pandemic. The last couple of factors that determine the severity of a pandemic are social factors, things like population density and sanitation, and finally, the prevention and control methods and how effective they are. So that's all those things I just listed, the social distancing, the contact tracing, the closing of borders, all the things that we've become aware of through COVID. Now, an important aspect to this is the acceptance by the population of those measures, the population's willingness to implement them. Australia did really, really well with mask mandates and social distancing, but in many other parts of the world, those measures were far less well accepted. We all know that in America, the wearing of a mask became in some ways a political statement, which to those of us who work in public health is just, it boggles the mind, but it became a political statement. And even in Australia, we have seen significantly reduced compliance as the pandemic progressed, and a level of fatigue with all those measures settled in. If another pandemic happened in the near future, there really are serious concerns about the community uptake of new vaccines and social measures, because there's also become a lot more vaccine hesitancy, ironically, through COVID. Okay, so that finishes the first part of our my talk tonight. So I'm going to move on now to looking at past pandemics, and we'll look at some of their key characteristics and what we can learn from them. And the first thing to know about pandemics is that they happen far more often than you would expect. The more developed our civilizations have become, with larger cities, greater population density, more exotic trade routes, faster travel, and increased contact with different populations of people, of animals, and of different ecosystems, the more likely it has become that pandemics would occur. Now, I'm going to start in Roman times with the Antonine Plague that happened in AD 165 to 180. And that's the first pandemic for which we have a level of relatively reliable historical information available. The map here shows in the darker grey the extent of the Roman Empire at that time, with the red dots being the places where we have reasonably reliable records of the plague occurring. Now, it wasn't actually the plague, although it's called the Antonine Plague, it wasn't the plague as we know it, but it was probably caused by smallpox or possibly measles. But either way, it was a disease for which it is likely that the population had absolutely no prior immunity. So if it was smallpox, the reproduction value, that R0, would have sat somewhere in the range of 3.5 to 6. So every person giving it to another 3, 4, 5, 6 people. The plague was brought to Rome by soldiers returning from Mesopotamia in the east. And so there was that high transmissibility combined with a high population density and the relative ease of movement that the Roman Empire enabled, and were the primary reasons why this plague or disease plague became a pandemic. It killed at least 5 million people, particularly in the cities, and that represented about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire at the time. That's a fairly scary thought. The next pandemic in history was a real plague, the plague of Justinian, and it started in Egypt and spread through the Eastern Roman Empire and its neighbours. It was a bacterial pathogen, Yersinia pestis, which is the plague as we know it, which is spread by fleas on rats. The death toll estimates, it happened in AD 541 to 750. It had many outbreaks over that pandemic period. And the death toll estimates vary widely from 25 to 100 million in the Roman Empire, and especially in its then capital of Constantinople. Its R0 was lower at around 1.5 to 1.9, but once again, it was that highly developed structure of the Roman Empire with its cities with high population densities that facilitated the spread of that plague along trade and military routes. And in contrast, this plague did not particularly affect the less organised barbarian societies outside of the Roman Empire. There may have been isolated outbreaks, but they didn't have those well-developed trade routes and those population densities, so it didn't get the hold that it did in the Roman Empire. The second pandemic of the plague was the Black Death, very well known to us, and that originated in East Asia. The map there shows some of the spread. And it swept across Central Asia and into Europe in the mid-1400s through the land and sea routes of the medieval Silk Road. It killed around 20 million people in its initial 4 years. You can see the dates there, 1347 to 1351. That was the initial epidemic. It's a lot bigger than an outbreak, the initial epidemic, and that killed around 20 million, and somewhere between 75 and 200 million died over its many outbreaks over the coming years. So that represented somewhere up to 50% of the world population. At the time, there was no treatment for the plague. You did have the first institutional responses for disease control began at this time, including sanitary cordons around cities, the separation of infected persons from the general population, the closure of ports to ships from infected areas, and periods of quarantine for travellers. These are things which have all become very familiar to us. They still work. You can see there the engraving of the plague doctor. It's looking very bird-like. They actually, in that beak, it was, I guess it's the first type of mask, but they actually kept herbs and things in that beak, which they felt cleansed the air and would prevent the spread of the plague. And they covered up well. So moving on from the Black Death, most people don't realise that a total of 7 cholera pandemics actually occurred between 1817 and 1961. Cholera is another bacterial disease, Vibrio cholerae, and it causes severe watery diarrhoea, and it's spread via contaminated water this time. Water sources become contaminated with bacteria from fecal matter, and those who drink the water become infected. It has an R0 of up to 2.6, and the case mortality rate can be up to 50%. Cholera was endemic in Asia until about 1817, when a first pandemic spread outwards from India. The pandemic emerged during a period of increasing globalization, resulting from technological progress in transportation. The advent of steamships and steam railways allowed a dramatic decrease in travel time and a rise in trade, just the same sorts of things that were happening in the Roman Empire. And at the time, the health prevention strategies in the 1800s that they had were essentially no different from what they had in the 1300s to deal with the Black Death. So it was cordons around cities and isolation and quarantine. It was during an outbreak in Soho in London as part of the second great cholera pandemic in 1854 that the physician John Snow used epidemiological methods of identification and mapping of cases for the first time. The map here is a map of the part of London where there was a particular outbreak, and John Snow mapped those cases very carefully. He also mapped then the pumps, because everybody's water came from pumps linked to wells, and he calculated the mortality per 1,000 persons. The red dots are where the people had died, and he noticed that all of the cases were clustered generally around the area of a particular pump in Broad Street. He convinced the authorities that of the risk the pump posed, and he had quite a deal of difficulty convincing the authorities of that. The handle to the pump was removed, meaning that people couldn't access that water anymore, and that brought the outbreak to an end really quite quickly. And his careful methods have led to John Snow being considered the father of epidemiology. We epidemiologists celebrate him quite widely, and there's a pub in Broad Street where you can go and see the pump. It's quite the landmark. It's what all the place the pilgrimage that all epidemiologists are supposed to do to the Broad Street pub. So we then come, as we move out of the 1800s, to a series of influenza pandemics. We're all aware that there are seasonal flu epidemics. We've all caught the flu, usually annually. And in a typical year, a flu epidemic will cause around 500,000 deaths worldwide, mostly in infants, the elderly, and those with chronic diseases. In other words, the most vulnerable groups within the population. On top of this, there have been multiple influenza pandemics since the 19th century. But interestingly, the impacts of flu on the population are not actually always higher during a pandemic than during a seasonal flu epidemic. What distinguishes a pandemic is a shift in the age distribution of mortality away from the elderly and the infants and towards younger adults, more into the middle. So overall, the impacts of an influenza pandemic depend on the transmissibility and virulence of the strain, and on the susceptibility of the population. which may vary according to age and past exposure to influenza viruses. The first influenza pandemic was the Russian flu. You may not have heard of that one, which spread around the planet in just 4 months in 1889. It reappeared annually for 3 years and killed about 1 million people. Its case fatality rate was low, so the mortality burden was relatively low. But the most well-known flu pandemic is the Spanish flu of 1918-1919, which was a type of influenza A, which is still with us today. It may, despite its name, have actually originated in the US. And like all flus, it's spread by respiratory droplets and contaminated surfaces and personal contact. It had an R0 of somewhere between 1.4 and 2.8, but up to 7.5 in confined settings. So you can imagine at the end of the war, in hospitals, in troop carriers, the way it spread. And it spread in 3 waves over a 9-month period in 1918-19, aided by those wartime conditions and post-war troop movements. It caused around 500 million infections and 50 million deaths, so a 10% mortality rate from flu. And it killed about 2.7% of the then world population, more than World War I killed. It killed the very young, as flu does, the very old, as flu does, and very many healthy young adults, which made it in the 20 to 40 years age group, which made it quite unusual. Interestingly, the mitigation measures were very similar to those for COVID-19, masks, social distancing, and confinement, what they call confinement. And I do love this grab from a newspaper of the time, which says, to prevent influenza. Now, these are quite interesting. You probably can't read them from there. Do not take any other person's breath, which is a wonderful way of saying, don't get up close and breathe in people's faces. Keep the mouth and teeth clean. Okay, that's not one that we've said. Avoid those that cough and sneeze. I think that's good general advice. Don't visit poorly ventilated places, and ventilation has been shown to be so important with COVID. Keep warm, get fresh air and sunshine, okay? Don't use common drinking cups, towels, etc. So that's your contaminated surfaces. Cover your mouth when you cough and sneeze. Again, very familiar. Avoid worry, fear and fatigue. So, yeah, when you're in a pandemic. Stay at home if you have a cold. Still one of the key messages of COVID. Walk to your work or office. So avoid public transport. Again, something we're still saying. And in sick rooms, wear a gauze mask, as in the illustration. I think that's incredibly telling that these are still the arrows we have in our quiver to fight these diseases. Sorry, I've just lost my place. So over the past century, it's descendants of that 1918 pandemic virus that have been the cause of almost all seasonal influenza A epidemics worldwide. Now, there were some further flu pandemics. I've gone ahead one too many. In 1957 and 1968, you probably have never heard of them. I hadn't until I was doing the research for this lecture. But they were mild in all of the affected areas and countries as a result of pre-existing immunity from the Spanish flu and its relations. So no specific containment measures were implemented in those pandemics. They basically passed through. They were there. There were a lot of infections, but they passed through without a lot of community awareness. So the next and most recent major flu pandemic was the swine flu in 2009, which many of you will remember. It originated in Mexico and the southern US, and it spread globally in just 6 weeks. It had an overall R0 of less than 1.6. It wasn't high. And it had a lower attack rate in older people, presumably because they had residual immunity from those 1957, 1968, and possibly even 1918-19 flus. Mortality rates in children, young adults, and pregnant women were higher than in a typical flu season, and the average age of death was actually just 37 years. It was very young. Overall, about 600,000 people died worldwide, And this was the first pandemic that we had faced where we were able to combine vaccine and antiviral usage. There were also non-pharmaceutical interventions that were recommended: hand washing, mask wearing, cough etiquette, although I don't think we were doing this yet. I think we were still doing this. Excuse me, I'll just have a quick mouthful. So as we moved into the 21st century, coronaviruses came to the fore as the new cause of pandemics. Bats are the natural hosts of coronaviruses, but they have proven able to jump from bats to intermediary animals like cats and camels and civets. And from there to humans. It started and we had little or no pre-existing immunity to these coronaviruses that are coming in through those animals. It started in 2003 with a bug called SARS-CoV, SARS standing for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, CoV is coronavirus, and it originated in China. SARS quickly became a global threat because it had very rapid transmission, a fairly high reproduction number of around 3, a high mortality rate of about 30%, and we had a total lack of prior immunity to it. But case identification and isolation, followed by the tracing of close contacts, contact tracing that we all know about now, and surveillance proved incredibly effective in containing that global threat and effectively eradicated the virus in around 7 months. You can see from the map, the darker colour are the countries where we did get cases. We had 6 cases in Australia, but no deaths. So it did spread widely, so it counted as a pandemic, but we were able to, through contact tracing, essentially smother it. Almost 10 years later, MERS-CoV was reported in Saudi Arabia. MERS standing for Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. We're terribly inventive in coming up with our names. It's estimated that between 50 and 80% of people who catch MERS require ICU treatment for respiratory and or renal failure. And the case fatality rate is very high at around 35%. Thankfully, it has a very low transmission rate. Its R0 is 1 or less. So person-to-person transmission is actually quite rare outside of healthcare settings, where it may occur when people are being intubated or things like that, and some very close family situations. So as a result of this and another highly effective worldwide public health response, MERS has killed less than 1,000 people to date. It has spread quite widely. You can see the purple, Saudi Arabia is where it has been concentrated, but it has spread to all of the countries with the other yellow, red, and sort of orangey colours there. MERS is still circulating today, and it does continue to present a potential threat to public health. It's believed that there's continuing transmission from camels to humans, resulting in sporadic cases and clusters that are still seen in the Middle East. Camel racing is a very, very high-profile sport in the Middle East, and it is traditional to kiss the camel at the end, the successful camel at the end of the race, and it is suspected that that may be the way that the virus is transmitted. So we reach the most recent and still current pandemic caused by SARS-CoV-2, Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, coronavirus number 2. Just noting that that's the name of the virus and the disease it causes is COVID-19. COVID-19 is not the name of the virus. So just looking at COVID in the same terms as the other pandemics, obviously it started in early 2020, maybe very late 2019 in China, and spread very quickly throughout most of the world. There were a few isolated parts of the Pacific which managed to avoid community cases for a very long time by shutting their borders, but eventually it spread throughout the globe. It is spread by droplets, aerosols, surfaces, and direct contact. Currently, the World Health Organization, or at least 2 weeks ago when I was putting this slide together, estimates there have been over 768 million cases and around 7 million deaths. So that gives us a case fatality rate of just under 1%. These numbers are always going to be somewhat rubbery, as different countries have different ways and different efficiencies of reporting cases and deaths. And as COVID has become normalised, There's significantly less testing happening. If we don't test, we don't find. And less reporting of particularly rapid tests, the rats, meaning that a substantial portion of cases go undetected or at least unreported. So these numbers can safely be assumed to be underestimates. When it comes to the R0 of COVID, there is a lot to unpack. Firstly, there have been many different variants, all with different characteristics. So the estimated R0 for the original or wild type of virus was somewhere between 2 and 3, perhaps as high as 5. For the Delta variant, it was likely higher at between 5 and 8, and Omicron could be as high as 9.5. But remember, R0 is the number of people an infectious person will pass the virus on to if there's no immunity and no protective measures in place. With contact tracing, social measures and vaccination in play, the effective reproduction number is much lower. And in Queensland at the moment, it's sitting at or around 1. Because of widespread vaccination, it's now very difficult to determine the R0 of any new variants. Now, I want to look briefly now at how the virus spread around the world. And to use this, I'm going to use a tool called an epidemic curve, or an epi-curve to its friends. This is a simple bar graph, as you can see here on the slide, of the number of new cases infected or at least reported per day. The daily count of cases is on the y-axis, which is on this side on this graph. So, and you've got time down here on the x-axis. So this graph, this epi-curve was put together by the World Health Organization, and it covers the period from December 2019, when we had no cases, through to mid-June when I was putting this together. And it also shows the cases from the different parts of the world in the different colours. You can see that the number increased comparatively slowly at first. It didn't feel it at the time. There was exponential growth going on, but it's hard when you look at a graph of the whole period, because what was happening at the beginning has been so dwarfed by what happened once Omicron came in. But you can see the number increased slowly at first, and it was primarily in the Americas, the yellow, and in Southeast Asia, the blue. Through the first 9 months of 2020, with Europe really taking off, the green, in late 2020. There were 3 major waves of infection, 1, 2, and 3, all of comparable size. And this was followed by a much more substantial worldwide outbreak here in December 2021 to March 2022, when Omicron took hold, with massive case numbers in Europe and in the Americas, and the first major outbreaks in the Western Pacific region. Finally, we see this incredibly high and narrow peak, dwarfing all the others for height in the Western Pacific, as China removed all of its tight controls on transmission and let it rip. Finally, throughout 2023, the last part of the graph here, reported case numbers have been relatively low, but as I've said, that doesn't mean it's gone away. In many ways, we're just not looking for it and not reporting it. I'm now going to move on to some more epi-curves, showing the way the virus moved through Queensland. This first graph covers just 2020. Again, the blue bars are your daily case counts, and the red line is the cumulative total, so all of them added together. We had our first case in Queensland on the 29th of January. And just over a week later, state emergency laws were passed, giving the Chief Health Officer the powers to force people into quarantine and others to be tested. On the 11th of March, the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, and we still had only a handful of cases, all of them acquired overseas, returning travellers coming back. But within a week, we were seeing local transmission within Australia, and we had our first death recorded on the 15th of March. On the 19th of March, the now infamous Ruby Princess cruise ship docked in Sydney Harbour, and that ship spawned 900 cases and 22 deaths. On the 20th of March, Australia closed her borders to all non-residents, and social distancing rules started to become law. 3 days later, Australia entered into the first stage of a nationwide shutdown, closing restaurants and pubs and gyms, etc. A further 3 days later, Queensland closed her borders to the other states for the first time in 100 years, and hotel quarantine was introduced for returning travellers. And really, you're seeing all these same measures that go right back to the Black Death. And because we had no vaccination, all we had to fight this with was those arrows that are very old, but they work. So you can see that once we shut the border here on that black line, yes, there was a bit of a lag because don't forget we still had people coming into hotel quarantine and transmitting a little bit, but very quickly that curve fell away. Because that 2 weeks is roughly an incubation period. So those measures that we undertook had a massive impact. Cases had been increasing exponentially, but the measures brought that all under control. By mid-April, we had over 1,000 cases in Queensland, with the majority overseas acquired. Thanks to the majority were overseas acquired, not locally acquired, thanks to the identification and isolation of cases and extremely effective contact tracing. Our contact tracing effort in Queensland and in Australia was fantastic. And there was the subsequent quarantine of those identified as close contacts. By mid-April, the epi curve was clearly heading right downwards, and restrictions on the population started to be relaxed. At the end of June, things were looking really good through this patch here. There were very few cases. But the Melbourne lockdown began as they failed to get on top of a major outbreak, and they had fast increasing case numbers. In these days before vaccination was available, Queensland kept her case numbers very low by shutting borders and putting resources into that case identification and contact tracing. As we moved into 2021, and this graph is to the same scale as the previous one, the general pattern stayed the same. Case numbers were low, with periodic outbreaks controlled by the actions of public health. This graph is the same scale, and we have only got sporadic cases and the occasional outbreaks to the end of November. Most of those cases are overseas acquired. These are people being identified in hotel quarantine. So that was through to the end of November. This graph ends on the 30th of November. We started the year with a cumulative total of just between 12 and 1,300 cases. And by the end of November, this had grown to just over 2,100 cases. That's an increase of just over 800. Most of those coming in from overseas, which is an incredible effort in a worldwide pandemic of a highly transmissible disease. But in mid-December, just after the end of this graph, Queensland opened her borders to other states, just as there were major outbreaks occurring. The international border had also started a staged opening process in November. And so everything the scale here changes. The maximum of the scale on the previous two graphs was 80. Now it's 20,000. So 20,000. Well, we didn't quite meet 20,000 per day, but we're up around 18,000 per day briefly. With the border opening came a massive increase in case numbers and deaths as well. And contact tracing ceased to be viable. And we in public health switched our focus to helping to control outbreaks in institutional settings like in aged care facilities and prisons with those vulnerable populations. So this final epi curve shows the 4 major waves of infection, each of them getting lower, that Queensland has experienced since the end of 2021. They do appear to be becoming progressively smaller and therefore presumably causing less mortality and morbidity, but the graph is actually somewhat deceptive. The availability of PCR testing changed through that period. It became less accessible and less strongly recommended by the government, meaning that many cases were not identified. Many people relied on rats, and while these were well reported on the Queensland Health website at the start of 2022, they're now very poorly reported. You can still report them. We'd still love you to report them, but I don't think anybody does anymore. And rats have also been found to have a 70% false negative rate, which means if you have COVID and you do a rat, 70% of the time it will give a negative result. So COVID has not gone away. It is still fairly rampant in our community, but because of vaccination, residual immunity from past infections, most people do not become too unwell, but it is still causing a substantial burden on our hospital and health systems. So, after a mouthful of water, we come to the last section of the lecture, and if we're honest, probably the bit you're all really most interested in. Are we ready for the next pandemic? The short and only possible answer to that question is it depends. It depends on a multitude of factors, many of which we've looked at as we've looked at past pandemics. Overwhelmingly, it depends on the bug, on the pathogen involved. And this has got a lot of facets, and I'm going to leave some of them till the end. So what else does it depend on? Well, and these are in no particular order, but I'll start with the availability of effective tests and treatments and vaccines, and or our ability to develop those and deploy them quickly. This is all linked with the pathogen involved. For bacterial and fungal pathogens, we have a wide range of tests and antibiotic and antifungal drugs available for treatment. But our antivirals, let's face it, are nowhere near as effective. So from a testing and treatment perspective, we are reasonably well prepared for a bacterial pandemic, but not so much for a viral. Looking at vaccines, for flu variants, we have in place processes to fairly rapidly develop strain-specific vaccines, but coronavirus vaccine technology is still very much developing, as we've seen through COVID. Although COVID did also show us how rapidly our world was able to develop new technology when the chips were down and resources were just thrown at the problem. So there is hope that if the next pandemic was the result of a novel virus or bacterium, then we would again be able to get vaccines and rapid tests developed relatively quickly. But it's not like the movies. Test and vaccine development take time. Takes many months or years, not days or weeks. So there will always be a lag time when we have to rely on other old school social methods to get things under control. There's also the question of whether there's any pre-existing immunity in the population or whether it is a completely novel bug. The Antonine Plague, way back, 165 AD, killed so many because the disease, most likely smallpox, was new to the population and there was no immunity. At the other end of the scale, the flu pandemics of 1957 and 1968 were relatively mild because of pre-existing immunity in the population from the Spanish flu and its relatives. So a pandemic of a flu virus related to, say, swine flu would have a level of immunity in the population, plus vaccination would be relatively quick to be implemented. So you can say that we are reasonably well prepared for that. So this brings me to the next two factors. Firstly, global cooperation and communication. Our ability to identify and then get an outbreak of a novel pathogen under control depends greatly on the willingness of governments in the affected areas to communicate openly and seek and receive cooperation from the wider world. One of the factors that helped the SARS pandemic back in 2003, we discussed earlier, to be brought under control, was early international cooperation. How well this will work in the future depends on many geopolitical factors that are way outside the scope of this evening's discussion. But imagine the time that would be lost if things started in an isolated or self-isolating country like, say, North Korea. That initial communication is really key to preventing outbreaks from turning into pandemics. Another key factor is staffing and what I'm going to call corporate memory. At the moment, we have many thousands of people worldwide with key hands-on experience in pandemic management. What worked, what didn't work. There are networks in place. People know each other. Communication is aided by all of this. If another pandemic started tomorrow, that would give us the best possible kickstart to deal with the issue. But the more time passes, the more we lose that corporate memory and experience and network. Yes, lots has been written down about the lessons that we have learnt from COVID, but all the planning in the world can't take the place of that personal knowledge, experience, and relationships. So from that perspective, ironically, the more time that passes, the less prepared we are. Then the staffing and the computer and data systems to support them are another major issue. I'm not just talking about hospital staff, although they are obviously very important. I'm talking about public health staff, specialist public health physicians and nurses, environmental health officers who were, in my opinion, the unsung heroes of COVID, epidemiologists, contact tracing officers, data specialists, lab and research staff as well. A massive workforce was mobilised worldwide to combat COVID-19. And most of those staff have returned to their normal jobs or left the workplace. Specialised computer and data systems were developed as part of the COVID response to aid these staff in their efforts. And public health staff need systems to aid case and contact tracing. It's all about record keeping. No government in the world can afford to keep such a workforce employed waiting for the next pandemic to hit. As a society, we are happy to pay the salaries of, say, firemen and ambulance workers, even when there's no fire or no accident, because we know if there's not one today, there'll be one tomorrow. And we are happy to pay. I had a friend who was a fireman and he spent a certain amount of time playing volleyball, waiting for the next fire. And we're happy to pay that because we need them. But it could be 100 years before the next pandemic. And that's a long time to pay a huge workforce to be on hand. It's not practical. So no government can realistically be fully prepared immediately to deal with a pandemic. It takes time to ramp up that full response. So finally, back to the bug. So much of whether we are really ready for the next pandemic depends on what pathogen is involved, or at least the characteristics of that pathogen. Firstly, there's its virulence and its mortality rate. It's how sick does it make people? A pandemic of a virus that causes little more than, say, a rash and a mild cough in over 90% of the people who are infected is far easier to be prepared for than something like MERS, which puts over 50% of cases into ICU, or Ebola that kills 50% of all people infected. Then there's the mode of transmission and the reproduction number. A virus which is airborne and which has a high reproduction number, like measles of 12 or more, is very hard to combat, particularly if we have no pre-existing immunity and no vaccine. Since the Spanish flu, we have been relatively lucky. Diseases have arisen with high mortality and morbidity rates, Ebola, MERS, SARS, HIV, but Ebola has a fairly low R0 of 2 and requires direct contact with bodily fluids for transmission to occur. So we've been able to get on top of outbreaks that have occurred. MERS has a very scary mortality rate, but it's hard to transmit from person to person. SARS was a much higher risk with a rapid transmission, high mortality, and no prior immunity. But the excellent communication and public health response got on top of MERS, and that pandemic had almost no impact on the general population. So, are we ready for the next one? The nightmare situation is a bug, probably a virus, for which we have no prior immunity, no existing tests, no treatment, and no vaccine, that has rapid person-to-person transmission, probably via airborne particles, droplets, and contaminated surfaces, all leading to a very high reproduction number. And finally, high mortality and morbidity rates. COVID-19, if you think about it, was actually pretty similar to this. No immunity, no tests, no vaccine, airborne. Its mortality rate was high, but not too frighteningly so. We combated it. Governments communicated and they cooperated. Public health measures were implemented to give us breathing space until we developed tests and vaccines. And so we coped. We were not ready for COVID, but we coped. And if you take a broad perspective, we coped pretty well as a global society. Yes, there were millions of deaths and millions too many, and many more people whose lives were damaged and that continue to be badly affected. But ultimately, our society did not collapse. So are we ready for the next one? The COVID experience suggests that we are as ready as we can be, but we cannot afford to let society's perception of the risks fade into the background because we're fatigued with the process, sick of testing, sick of vaccines, sick of masks, and sick of being careful. We must continue to be vigilant, both as individuals and as communities and countries. Vitally, we must continue to communicate and cooperate on a global level and not forget the lessons that COVID and all those past pandemics have taught us. Thank you.
Dale, can I just ask one question? Why were the African cases so minimally represented? Was it just that they didn't present the data, or if we know that
Yeah, okay, so for those on Zoom, the question is, why were African cases so poorly represented? What we believe is largely it's poor low levels of testing, low levels of reporting. If you don't look, you can't find. So that's the key. But also in some of those areas, the population density is not high. And again, it's all about interconnectedness and fast travel between places. And so there was an element of contact tracing and isolating of contacts over there, which in a more rural, less connected society in those parts of Africa did keep things contained to an extent. But yeah, there was a very different testing regimes and reporting regimes in different parts of the country, of the world.
Just before we go to the audience here, are there any on Zoom? Okay, there are no questions on the chat. So we'll go to questions from the floor. Gentleman over here. I'll just give you this so they can hear.
I often hear about reports of avian flu outbreaks, and there's a dire response because of fears of it crossing over humans, and from human bird seed. Has there been, like this has been going on for a long time, has there been any effort to work towards a vaccine in case that does happen?
Well, if I go back through my slides to my swine flu slide, the swine flu was actually a bird flu and a human flu that went into pigs. So we've actually, these avian flus are out there all the time, and they are very much this H1N1, influenza A. So that is actually a bird flu. So we've got quite good vaccines for these. But as we know, because the reason we have a flu vaccine every year is they're different strains. And this is the key with even, with COVID as well, these different strains. And we really need a flu vaccine that hits all influenzas, not strain specific. But there is a lot of work being done, and there's a lot of work being done on broad spectrum, if you want to call it. How we have broad spectrum antibiotics versus very targeted antibiotics. A broad spectrum flu vaccine is sort of what we're aiming for, or what the researchers are aiming for. It's not an area I work. So yes, there's a lot of work being done in that area. It is a constant threat. One of the greatest threats facing us is this, particularly with increasing population densities and people, a lot of we all know about the wet markets in China and where COVID may have arisen. You're getting all sorts of non-domesticated animals and birds coming in, mixing with people, mixing with other animals, being put in much closer contact than they would normally. And this is what viruses love, and they pass between them, and they swap bits of their genomic material and then can end up passing to person, which is how swine flu started. So yes, there is a lot of work happening in that space, but that's not something I'm an expert in. I'm not a virologist, unfortunately.
Okay, more questions from the floor?
Just a comment. I think that the Moderna are making an RNA flu virus, which is available now. That means that the response time is so much. You
yes,
don't have to grow them in
absolutely. It removes the whole egg process from it all. Yeah,
not alone.
No, there's COVID's really kick-started a lot of that work. Yes.
RNA flu virus.
Flu vaccines. Yep.
What's the outlook for HIV?
Actually, I'm not sure. I stayed away from HIV when I was putting this together because it is such a different. It is another pandemic.
Pandemic.
It is a pandemic.
It's endemic.
But I'm not sure what it is now. It was quite high in its initial. So I know it was high, but I can't give you a number at this point. Not as high as measles or any of those.
Just
but
quick terms. To get HIV, you have to work PRs.
fair enough. Yeah. It's a very specific set of circumstances in which HIV is transmitted, and that's why I stayed away from it. I mean, it is direct contact, It's also very specific direct contact that you require. So, but again, it is a pandemic.
You would be involved in that.
No, actually, I can't even see HIV data at Queensland Health. It is so confidentialised that I actually don't even have access to HIV. Only specialists in sexual health get to work on HIV. So special units, yeah.
So it's, you want to ask me? Oh,
I was just saying it's a touchy subject, HIV.
It still is, but it is yeah, it's the only type of data that the only communicable disease data that I can't access at work. Yeah. But that's the purview of a specific group.
Yeah, you sort of can get that. It's like the sort of role of it.
Oh yeah, but I mean, I don't have access like on my desktop, and I'm not reporting on that because I do a lot of reports on all sorts of communicable diseases, respiratory, gastroenteric, all sorts of, and sexually transmitted, so syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, you know, all the fun things. Yes. How was your day at work today, dear? Well, I looked at chlamydia. So, you know, it's the chlamydia data anyway. But not HIV.
we have other questions. Yes, Paul.
In disaster management, they use data from mobile phones, or computers, if you like. Do epidemiologists use that keywords in that media? Looking for people reporting effects of a pandemic.
Yes.
If you're monitoring mobile phones, etc.
No, we don't. We don't do that. The question, sorry, for those on Zoom, is about whether we use mobile phone data. We don't. There was talk about using flybys data when we were trying to trace contacts, you know, whether we could access, we didn't, but the question was asked, but no, we don't. To access that data, you've got to be police. So there have been isolated instances, I believe, where we have been, where warrants have been gained, and things can happen under the Public Health Act, but that's the Environmental Health Officers
I think
to deal with that.
done using Google searches and also Twitter.
Oh, we use all sorts of
Twitter
things.
database.
Yes, there's lots of information that is available on the web if you know where to look.
Yeah, I mean, the actual search criteria that people put into Google gets reported, and we told that there was, the idea is that perhaps if an outbreak is coming.
Yes, and certainly there's been a lot of work done on people Googling symptoms of respiratory symptoms and Googling testing and things to look at early warning. We're always looking for canaries in the coal mine and to look at whether that is a good predictor. If you see Google searches increasing, is that a predictor of the early start of the flu season or something else? Yeah.
We have a question on chat here from Kay Rees. What do you expect the impact of newer technologies will be, such as gene editing and standardized vaccines might be, the impact of those sort of technologies?
That's, I'm afraid, a bit outside of my area of expertise as an epidemiologist. Again, that's more our lab virologists and everything who would be talking about the gene editing technology. Mostly the gene technology that we use is about determining specific strains and we do whole of genome sequencing and to determine whether, you know, if a person over here has got hepatitis A, so sorry, that's in the media at the moment because we've had some hepatitis cases, and then a person over here has hepatitis A, we do the whole of genome sequence to work out, is this exactly the same bug? So that's the genomics that the epidemiologists tend to work on. It's looking at gene technology to gene sequencing to determine whether there are links between outbreaks. And so we're looking for smoking guns and things. But for the gene editing, I'm afraid I'm not really qualified to go down that path and answer that question.
Could I ask a question? Are there people in your area working on the impacts of climate change?
Yes.
Some of these diseases?
Impacts of climate change is, we've got one of our public health physicians, that is her key area of interest. And one of the things that our unit does a lot of is mosquito surveillance, because we're very worried about dengue, fever, all of the mosquito-borne viruses coming south and also coming in from overseas. And so that's just one of the issues that we are constantly looking at. Yes, we've got a doctor who that's her specialty, or her special area of interest anyway. And we do a lot of work in that particularly that mozzie space. Yeah.
Do we have other questions? Or we wait for supper? Supper's ready, thank you, Mary. As geographers, this has been really interesting because, of course, you've shown us a lot of maps. Which we don't always get. But, I have to say, Snow has always been regarded as a geographer. He was one of the first he's sort of a medical geographer.
Yep. Well,
And because he was the first one to map and,
Yes.
and sort out the problem of that pump.
absolutely.
So he drew the map, so we claim him.
Fair enough. Yeah, well, he's very much regarded as the father of modern epidemiology. So
Yeah.
That pump is very, very important in epidemiology. He
Yeah.
did great work. He saved many, many lives.
Yes, indeed. And that's where the linkage is.
Yes.
With
Yes.
geography and geographic interest.
Mhm.
But look, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting, insightful presentation about something that we've all experienced in the last few years. And certainly the history of going way back that you've presented really puts things in perspective, I believe. And hopefully we will be more prepared for the next one from, some of the things you have presented that we can do and will still be doing. Many of the things that were done 100 years ago are still very effective.
They still work.
Seems.
Yeah.
So will you join me, please, in thanking Gail for tonight? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll just invite you to join us for supper.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity.